I think the impact of peak oil is going to vary between country a great deal. The countries I'm particularly concerned about are those poor countries, mainly in Latin America or in Africa, where they don't have very much foreign exchange, they don't have very many dollars, but they have to pay for the oil, the imported oil, in dollars. So these countries end up being very vulnerable to variations on the oil market. One country in particular, Senegal, I believe, are very vulnerable, as they generate 76–77% of their electricity from oil, and it's all imported oil. So where we tend to think about peak oil being an oil shortage, being a vehicle shortage, transportation shortage, in many countries it's an electricity shortage, which in some ways is more serious, because with electricity is communications, is refrigeration, is lighting, and I think these areas, these parts of the world, are going to be the areas that are hit first, because the only reason why the price of oil is going to increase is to cause some demand destruction in some markets, and it's these poorer countries in the world that are most vulnerable. The UK is quite a special case because just less than a decade ago, 98, 99, the UK was a large exporter of oil, perhaps the 9th largest exporter, exporting about a third of the production. In 2006, the UK became a net importer for the first time, and the North Sea is declining quite rapidly now. So what used to be injecting billions of pounds into the Treasury every year is now starting to cost the economy and is going on to the trade deficit. So it's not so much that the UK will have an oil shortage, because the UK is a relatively wealthy country and we're going to be able to outbid poorer countries for the oil. But it's what it does to the national economy, where it goes from earning us, the North Sea earns us billions of pounds per year, to costing us billions of pounds per year, and how that affects the strength of the currency and the strength of the economy. So I see peak oil in the UK point of view as an economic crisis rather than an energy crisis. That's not to say the UK doesn't have an energy crisis, but that is more to do with the natural gas in the North Sea and our nuclear power stations being decommissioned, and a portion of our coal power stations being decommissioned for environmental concerns. Renewables are going to make a big difference, but I can't imagine renewables or and conservation will be able to offset these three declines in electricity supply. I think the problem with biofuels is you have to look at it in the bigger picture. Over the next 50 years, the population on the planet is expected to increase by 50%. Also during that time, the area under agriculture is likely to decrease as climate change increases desertification, as urban expansion covers tarmacs over some of the best land. As climate change also causes glaciers to melt, and meltwater, which is currently irrigating large parts of Southeast Asia, dries up. So from an agricultural point of view, we're faced with increasing demands for food from less agricultural land. And if we consider peak oil and energy decline as well, then we'll have less mechanization and less petrochemical inputs. So all these factors are working in the wrong direction. So I don't see that we have the capacity to divert any agricultural product into food, into energy away from the food market. And there's also a moral issue of joining for the first time the energy market and the food market. Traditionally, the food market and energy markets have been separate. And a very, very wealthy person doesn't actually eat tremendously more than a very poor person. But a very wealthy person does use tremendously more energy than a poor person uses. Now, if you link those two markets together, that increases the appetite of a very wealthy person who can now eat as much food as would feed a whole village just by flying his airplane a lot. I I think the current understanding of climate change, the analysis that the IPCC have done with their scenarios, doesn't take into full account the latest thinking on oil reserves and on peak oil. For example, the IPCC scenarios are based on socio-economic and technology trends for the future CO2 emissions rather than a calculation based on the reserves. So when we factor in peak oil, then I think we can see that there will be less CO2 in the atmosphere. So in that respect, you could say peak oil is good news for climate change. There is a complicating factor in that the IPCC scenarios are probably also conservative in the effect of the CO2. So on both sides of the equation, you could say the IPCC overestimate the amount of the CO2, but then underestimate the effect. So I don't suggest that peak oil mitigates climate change problem. Whether peak oil is good news for climate change or not, to answer that question, we need to look at two scenarios. A scenario where peak oil didn't exist and a scenario where peak oil did exist. And if peak oil didn't exist, we're left with the IEA thinking from 2004, which showed oil supply increasing from 84, 85 today up to 120 million barrels a day in 2030. So that's where we'd be if there was no peak oil. If we do have a peak oil, as ASPO are suggesting, then by 2030, that oil supply could be down to 60 million barrels a day. Now, there are alternatives. There are coal to liquids, there are heavy tar sands, there are biofuels, there are gas to liquids. But even when you make analysis of all these and add them all up, we don't get up to 120 million barrels a day. So the two scenarios, the peak oil scenario and the no peak oil scenario, whichever way you run the numbers, in 2030, an arbitrary date in the future, there's probably less carbon going into the atmosphere in the peak oil scenario. I think we need to consider peak oil and climate change together, simultaneously, as a single problem. If we just try and address peak oil, then it's just an energy problem, and we turn to very dirty sources of energy, which could even exacerbate the climate change problem. Similarly, if we just consider climate change on its own, we might turn to natural gas as a lower CO2 form of energy, but then run into energy shortages and energy security of supply issues on the gas side. So whenever we're thinking about action for the future, we need to evaluate it from a peak oil point of view, an energy security point of view, but also a climate change point of view. And there are some things that overlap. Energy conservation always overlaps. It's good news for climate change and it's good news for energy security. And from the position we find ourselves now, energy conservation is almost certainly the most economic and the quickest way to improve the supply-demand balance.